you. So I guess we will get started. Thank you so much for joining us for this afternoon's Teach Educational Round. Here with us we have Donna Alexander, who will be presenting a clinical practice framework for working with clients of African descent. But before I hand it off to our presenter, I am just going to go over a few housekeeping slides as per usual. So first of all, if you are interested in obtaining a letter of completion for this month's Teach Educational Round, please make sure that you have registered for this webinar and completed the pre-learning assessment. You have signed in to view this webinar using your first and last name so we can track your participation. And finally, you complete the evaluation and post-learning assessment, which will be emailed to you, and you will have 1 week to complete this. These webinars are being live tweeted, and you can follow us on Twitter at PSQuitSmoking or use the hashtag TeachWebinar to post or read questions. Here's a faculty biography of our presenter, Donna Alexander, who graduated from the University of Toronto with a Master of Social Work specialization in addiction and mental health. She worked in correctional services and residential treatment service before transitioning to the substance abuse program for African, Canadian, and Caribbean youth at CAMH. She has no faculty or she has no disclosures to declare. And this is just a friendly reminder that the content of Teach Educational Rounds are based on evidence-based guidelines from the following sources. These materials, as well as the verbal presentations and any discussions, set out only general principles, and they do not replace the need for clinical assessment or treatment plans by healthcare professionals. Now, before I hand it off to our presenter, I'm just going to do a couple of polling questions just to gauge who has joined us here today. So in a minute, using your computers, could you please indicate which of the following organizations you work for? And if your organization isn't here, you can always type it in the chat box. So it looks like we have some family health teams, public health units, addiction agencies. Great, thank you. And now in a minute, again, using your computer, could you please indicate what your current discipline is? And you may need to scroll down to see all the options. So we have addiction counselors, registered nurses, health promoters and educators, tobacco quit specialists, thank you. And finally, using your computer, could you please indicate what region your organization serves? So we have Eastern area, Toronto and Greater area, Southwest area, Central area. Thank you, everyone. So we are just waiting for Donna. She is running a little bit late. So I can open up for questions or anything that anyone wishes to learn from today's webinar. You can just press *1 to unmute your line, and then with that, I can deliver them to Donna when she arrives. Sorry, everyone. Does anyone have anything to share? Just press *1 to unmute your line. Oh, and it looks like we have our presenter. Thank you, everyone, for waiting. We will just give a few seconds to let her get settled in. Hello. And you can just press the down button to change the slide. Yeah. Right there.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Technology for you. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so actually 1 minute, I'm going to need my glasses. Okay. So do I need to adjust for sound? Oh, okay, great. Okay, so today I wanted to talk about the clinical practice framework for working with clients of African descent. And I'm hoping to do two things in the time that I have. I want to tell you what's important in working with these clients and also why it's important. And those of you that are familiar with the structure of clinical practice framework know that they're usually structured in Word documents. So it's a little bit it's a bit challenging doing it in this format, but nevertheless, I'm hoping to convey as much information as I possibly can. So, okay, I'm just going through here. Okay, so
The down button.
down button, this one?
Oh, just click it right, the down button right here.
This one?
That one, yeah.
Okay.
So you're supposed to learning objectives?
Okay, learning objectives. What is it?
Right there. Oh, there.
Okay, so first of all, before we talk about that, we need to talk about the Black community in context. So right now, the Black population in Canada is, well, we're talking about, let's limit it to Toronto. So we're talking about the population as it is now is the third largest visible minority group in the Greater Toronto area. And what we've known for a while, we've known about the vulnerabilities in the indigenous population, but Black youth are also deemed to be the most vulnerable in terms of next to indigenous youth. And what we're talking about is in mental health service, people of African descent are overrepresented in imposed services such as child welfare, correctional services, and in fact, they're underrepresented in volunteer services such as psychiatric outpatient services or residential treatment services. So that's important to know for service providers. What we also know, we also know about the Alpha immigrant effect, but beyond that, what we know is that, and they've done studies about this, is that Black immigrants are less likely than born Canadians to use a mental health service in primary care or in specialty settings. And in fact, for when we talk about psychosis, in particular, we're talking about it takes at least 18 months longer for Black youth experiencing psychosis to access service than their white counterparts. And there are different theories as to why this happened. A lot of it is fear on the part of the Black community, some of it as a result of stigma. But for the most part, it's due to a lack of trust in the system and a lack of ethno-specific services, a lack of culturally affirming services. So usually the population, Black people, wait much longer to access services as a result of this fear. And the service itself, the system, how it's set up, can be quite intimidating for a lot of Black people. And this is something that I hear very frequently from people in the community. So, and pathway to for services, especially, I'm referring a lot to the Black youth because I've been working specifically with Black youth since 2005. So most of my expertise and my experiences with Black youth. So when I'm using examples, and I'll use those as examples. So when we talk about clinical practice framework for working with Black youth, for working with the Black population, we have to talk about the core components, meaning if we're going to have a service, at the very, very least, right, it has to have good, robust clinical biopsychosocial assessment. So that's a given. But it also, and then effective intervention strategies. There also has to be a training component, whether you're going to train other social workers or you're going to train students, you're going to teach, but there has to be a training component as well. And a huge part of it has to be community engagement, and as well as the underlying theoretical framework, DBT. We've also, at CAMH, I know we've made adjustment to the standard CBT. So now we have CBT for clients of African Canadian descent or Spanish descent or Francophone descent, as long as the structural theory, all of the other different theoretical modalities that inform and support treatment. So that's the core part of it. Research is also a part of any program has to have these, right? A research component, a teaching component, and of course an evaluation component. And so a Black framework includes all of those, right? But in my view, these are just a minimum that it has to have, right? These are the ones that are taken for granted. So all of these these are, you know, I'm thinking, okay, everybody should have this at the very minimum, no matter what service you are, and certainly Africans, and certainly an approach geared to African people of African descent have all of these, right? But beyond all of these, right, what we're talking about for SAPAC specifically and for other services that are geared towards servicing Black community, right? The service has to be rooted in the community. So the service needs to be rooted in the community because the community informs, because the service is informed. The service is informed and has to be in response to whatever is happening in the community. So the service cannot be, so even though, no matter where the services are situated, if it's ethno-specific, it needs to be rooted and be grounded in the community. And right now when we talk about, for example, right now when we talk about in the community, we have to talk about what is happening in the Black community. And so right now in the Black community happens right now to be experiencing a serious mental health crisis. You know, historically we've always known about the rates of homicides within the community, right? But now the community is grappling with a really severe, like never before, in terms of the level of suicides that we're seeing in the Black community. So not only are we dealing with homicides as a result of gang and gun violence, but now we're dealing with a lot of Black youth especially, and some older adults that are taking their lives. And so that's what's happening in the community. And so the service, any Black service, has to be informed and be in response to all of these things, because it cannot be in isolation. And so because what we're noticing is that as a community, we're losing our protective factors. Before we had all of these protective factors, religious, cultural, that prevented us from taking our lives. But as a part of the assimilation process, we've lost all of that. And so now we have Black people that are taking their lives that are more statistically like never before, right? So another key component of providing services to Black people is that it needs to be Afrocentric. And it needs to be Afrocentric because all of us, most of us that are service providers that are providing services generally across the board, right, we were trained in the Eurocentric point of view. And the Eurocentric point of view, yes, it works, but we need to reconsider that because as one of the most racially diverse cities in the world, it cannot be that that the overwhelming modality for training and for teaching is from a Eurocentric point of view. Because, for example, like an Afrocentric approach of many strengths, but, you know, I'll go back into that. So it has to be anti-racist, has to consider diversity within the Black community, has to include the social determinants of health, has to be trauma-informed, has to be culturally safe and affirming, has to have a gendered analysis, because there's a different way to provide service based on whether you're male or female, right? It also has to consider the intersectionalities of race, class, gender, sexual orientation. And of course, this is the most important thing, is that it has to consider, it has to have an impact, it has to focus on resiliency and strength and resiliency. And I'm going to explore all of those further. So this is what we're talking about when I talk about rooted in the community, and we talk about the mental health crisis. We talk about we need to work in collaboration with community partners, and because long-term recovery happens and is supported in the community. So when we talk about Afrocentric, and for those of you, just very brief, when we talk about an Afrocentric approach, we're talking about an approach where every intervention, every thought, every service idea is viewed from the perspective of an African person. And so Afrocentric means taking the best out of the culture, the approach, and incorporating that into care and into service provision, into service planning, and into service delivery, where mostly everything is viewed, okay, what are the strengths, what are the benefits that this approach has to offer, and incorporating that into the traditional or into the Eurocentric approach, right? Or in fact, using those approaches. And so the reason why it needs to be Afrocentric is as a result of the negative experiences, as a result of being Black. Most of our children right now is experiencing what we would call a crisis of identity. There's a lack of racial pride right now among Black youth. And some of them are saying, I don't want to be Black. And some are even refusing to identify as Black. And the reason why they're doing that is because, just imagine right now, Black people only make up 3% of the population. And so if overwhelmingly you're such a small part of the population, but you're not seeing yourself reflected often enough, so you're not validated. And when you see yourself reflected, it's often in a very negative light. And so for people that are in a majority culture where most of the people are Black, they often don't experience this crisis of identity because all around them, everything is culturally affirming. But if you're in a country like Canada where you're such a small percentage of the population, then there's a chance that you will experience all of this when everything around you is always so negative, right? And so the reality is that African communities have a deep and rich source of values. And it is beneficial to incorporate African-centered values, a worldview, value system, ways of knowing, rituals, and life-affirming practices into actual clinical practice. And so sometimes when we're doing the work, especially I was just doing some work with prisoners, with some inmates in the federal system. And so when we do life mapping with them, what we do is that we incorporate African Adinkra symbols. Because way, way back, historically, African people had a way of organizing ourselves, and it's usually through symbols. And so what we ask them to do is we give them about 300 different symbols that means different things: strength, value, integrity, determination, all of these. And we say, okay, choose a value that's going to guide your life from now on. And this is how you do a life mapping. And these are the things that you incorporate from all of these Afrocentric symbols into your life from now on. And so these are things that we also do with clients in terms of what are the Afrocentric values. You know, we have the 7 values that most of the time people use at Kwanzaa, but there are also a lot of different values that a lot of us, even from the community, we don't know about. So it's important that we incorporate all of these, right? And the reason why we consider an Afrocentric approach is because the population is so racially diverse, we need to, then it becomes more relevant to use other approaches as well, as opposed to just one single approach. And we talk about training before, I touched briefly on that, but I think we have to challenge a Eurocentric social theory as a defining reality and the frame of reference for African people and their lives in Canada. And so a lot of the work we do with clients is to foster critical thinking and conscious raising among Black clients in order to support long-term recovery. And so when I go to the prison and I say to them, what percentage of the population do you think you are? Okay, and what percentage, are you represented inside the prison population? That's very enlightening for them. They've never thought about that before. But whereas we go there in order to do trauma work with them, these are some of the things that we start to talk to them about in terms of critical thinking to build resilience. So second thing is working with clients from that are African, and I'll just say Black because it's simple, is that the practice needs to be anti-racist and anti-oppressive. And so because of the realities of Black youth based on racism, based on classism, based also on a history of colonialism, homophobia, and oppressive social systems in the child welfare, school system, justice system, and also in the healthcare system. So when you talk about Black people, the lives of Black people right now, every single system, we're at risk, we're vulnerable. Every single system is oppressive. When we talk about the child welfare system, we're talking about 8% of children, across the population, or right now, Black people in Toronto, we're less than 10% of the population. But at one point, 41% of our children were in the welfare system, the child welfare system. When we talk about the school system, 12% of school population, but 32% of children that are expelled or suspended from school. When we talk about the justice system, we talk about longer sentences for the same crime, and also talking about the school to prison pipeline, right? And when we talk about the healthcare system, we're not faring any better in the healthcare system. Because overall in the healthcare system, especially when we talk about people with mental illnesses, if there is going to be a death in healthcare system, then the statistics overwhelmingly will show that even though the deaths are not called at the facilities where they originate, most of the deaths that occur within the healthcare system are, in fact, and for years have been young Black men. So, and that's something we don't talk about. That is something that we never talk about, the amount of deaths that we have in the healthcare system, especially when it comes to mental health, into the procurement of mental health services, and that most of the time young Black men are extremely vulnerable within the healthcare system. And so we also have to consider internalized racism and oppression, because as Black people cannot live in the system without experiencing internalized racism and oppression. It's just not possible. Every single day, a lot of us have to check ourselves to make sure, and so for a lot of our kids, the ones that are saying, I don't want to be Black, that's as a result of internalized racism and oppression that they feel and they experience, and now it's a part of them. They also start to have negative feelings about being Black, about their race, and also perpetuating the cycle of oppression. And so as service providers, we have to be careful not to perpetuate the cycle of oppression. So there needs to be a recognition that repeated exposure to microaggression, marginalization, discrimination, and the presence of adverse racial socialization and racism is a reality for Black clients that worsen their experience of mental illness. So that needs to be taken into consideration, and that's why the practice to work with them has to be anti-racist and anti-oppressive, at the very, very least. So anti-racist, anti-oppressive interventions involve encouraging clients to identify the ways in which oppressive structures have impacted their lives and how to resist these oppressive structures. And when we talk about resistance, we're not talking about resistance in the way how people traditionally view resistance. We're talking about coping strategies, right? So when I say to a client, when a client, for example, is in an institution for 3 years and they're doing well, and for some reason, they're not going home, and they're not able to go home for a while, and being in the institution is contributing to a decline in their mental health. When I say to that client, I need you to resist, what I'm actually saying to the client is, I need you to figure out ways in which you're going to deal with it, in which you're going to cope, so that this does not further compromise your mental health. When I say to a child that's in the school system, that's been expelled and they're home, and when I say to youth all over there that are experiencing concurrent disorders, I need you to resist. This is what I'm talking about. When I say to them, you need to resist because resistance is in your DNA. And so think about, go away and come back and think about ways in which you need to resist all of these challenges that you have. This is what I mean. I mean, think of creative ways. Think of ways in which you're going to cope, you're going to respond into these things so that you're not defeated by all of these oppressive structures that are around you that you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So we need to understand that the healthcare system is not immune to the realities of institutionalized racism and this impact, and the outcome of Black clients living with concurrent disorders, and is committed to engage in advocacy to facilitate desired treatment outcomes. Because if the system within itself is oppressive, right, then as service providers, we have to be prepared to work with clients in order to resist these, and if they're not able to do so, to show them how to do that, and also to support them resisting and to resist the oppression. So we talk about it. I think I deleted youth focus because at first I thought we were talking about, and then I decided to leave it, right? So there's a recognition that Black youth living with mental illnesses, their treatment needs are very different from Black adults, right? And so for Black youth especially, the whole thing about stigma and cultural biases, that's a huge thing for them. A lot of clients don't even want to, a lot of Black youth, and when I say you, I mean we go up to age 24, they don't even want to come to ChemH because they don't want anybody to see them coming here. And so part of the adjustment we've made is that, okay, you don't want to come here? We'll go out, we'll see you in the community. You know, so some of the best work doesn't have to be within the bounds of an office. It could be in a park. It could be down the street. It could be after work at the Tim Hortons. It could be wherever the client feels comfortable, right? It doesn't have to be the Eurocentric approach where it's 60 minutes in my office or 50 minutes in my office. Because we don't work like that, being a culture, of a narrative culture. We don't really, that's not something that we do. We tell stories. And this is, you know, this is a part of it. And so service have to take that into consideration. So when we talk about treatment, right, we have to consider the social determinants of health within treatment, right? We cannot provide effective mental health and addiction support to clients if they're living on the street, if they don't know where their next meal is coming from, if they're afraid of being raped in the park, if they're living in the stairwell, then how can we skip over all of these factors and say, okay, let's just focus on your mental health and your addiction? It doesn't work like that. So poverty, the lack of opportunities, the lack of basic necessities of life impact on clients' mental health, their prospect of their recovery and life trajectory. And we also, so sometimes during the first session, it's not an assessment or an intake about your mental health. It's an intake about how is your life situation overall. Where do we start from? What is your most immediate need? What's your immediate need? Because no point talking about the mental health piece if the client is too preoccupied with, okay, it's cold tonight and I don't think I can really stay outside tonight. So it's unreasonable then to expect clients to recover if their lives are so unstable, and if we don't address that part of it first. And so intervention must include consideration of adequate housing, the impact of poverty, how lack of education, employment opportunities among Black people, how these affect racism, all of these.
because when we talk about racism, then it has to do with housing, right? Or you're going to get, what's the extra effort that you need to do in order to get housing? Affordable housing, right, as a Black person, given the current situation of difficult housing and how that impacts you with everything else. And the other part we need to talk about is that it has to be, working with Black people must utilize a trauma-informed practice. So when we talk about a trauma-informed practice, we're talking about, we know overall as clinicians that we need to utilize a trauma-informed practice, right? And we know all about primary, the primary, the secondary, intergenerational trauma. And a lot of us work from that approach. We all work from that perspective. Okay, well, these are the different trauma approaches, right? But I think what a lot of us are just starting to realize is that we need to talk about, and so we need to talk about the racial trauma piece as well. Because a lot of time where clients are able to recover and to respond from the various different traumas, when it comes to racial trauma, they have a much more difficult time recovering from racial trauma. And it's just now that we're starting to talk about racial trauma among Black people. We're starting to do the research, we're starting to review the literature, and we're starting to teach clinicians about racial trauma. We've only just started the surface of the work that we really need to do in terms of developing our knowledge gap and increasing the knowledge base about racial trauma and the impact on racialized, not only Black people, but racialized group, in working with racialized group, right? Because a lot of times, even when we're doing the assessment, a lot of times that's not something we even think to address, to talk about. And especially if clinicians are of the dominant culture, then this is not something that's usually on their radar. But we're talking about the impact of racial trauma, the psychological impact, how devastating it can be. And, in my own work, even with my coworkers, with people that I've worked with, I just know someone that even yesterday we talked about 31 years old doing a PhD and talking about, and a lot of Black, even Black clinicians would tell you that in the process of obtaining a PhD, most of them will tell you that the process literally causes them to lose their minds. So we're having a whole bunch of Black PhDs that are graduating at this time, and overwhelmingly they're saying, you know what, the process of getting this PhD literally affected my mental health to such an extent that I don't think I'll ever be able to recover from it. And these are people that have gone into the process, with resilience, with strength, with a lot of smart. And then they're saying this. So when we talk about that, and we talk about clients, and there's people that are going in there with so much strength, are having such a hard time coping, then just imagine people clients that they're also coping with substance dependence or other different forms of mental illness, and also coping with a long history of untreated trauma. And so special attention then needs to be given to racial trauma among clients and the lifelong negative effect, including fatalism, anger, and hypermasculinity. And we talk about racial trauma, we're talking about racial trauma within the systems. We're talking about, we're seeing a whole bunch of clients right now that as a result of negative interactions with law enforcement, is that just the sight of a police officer or someone in uniform is enough for them to experience extreme panic because of experiences when they were 12, 13, 14, and 15 years old. And especially because most of our boys, by the time they're 14 or 15, they're already 6'5" and 230 pounds. And so when people look at them, they're viewed as a threat. And so, you know, people look at them in the community and they're so big that people automatically assume that they're much bigger, much older than they actually are, and puts them at increased risk of the systems coming in conflict with them, and for them to experience trauma as a result of the system. So when we talk about, cultural safety, I would say is extremely important in the provision of care to Black clients. And this makes up a huge part of the actual framework. And cultural safety, this has been around since the 1980s. And it was a framework for the delivery of service in the indigenous communities, but it's since expanded. So for a while now, different clinicians across the board have been using this approach. So it's an environment that is spiritually, socially, physically, and therapeutically safe for clients, where there's no denial of their identities, of what they need. And so it's about shared respect, shared knowledge, and collaboration between the clinicians and the clients. And it's also about examining our own cultural identities and our attitudes, and being open-minded in our attitudes towards people from cultures other than our own. So when we talk about cultural competence, right, I often say it's extremely difficult to be culturally competent, because when we live in such a culturally diverse society, right, racially, culturally, how can any one of us really purport, how can we claim that, you know what, we're culturally competent? I don't know that I can say that I'm culturally competent. But what I can do is endeavor to practice in a culturally safe way, because it's about me. It's about constantly checking in with myself. It's not about knowing all about the different cultures and then trying to develop competence to work with people from all over, because there's so many different subcultures. And so when we talk about, because it's important to practice from a culturally safe point of view, because cultural beliefs, they're important in the psychopathology and the presentations of mental illnesses and substance dependence. And not only is it's important because it influences all aspects of service provision, from help seeking to engagement behaviors, to building therapeutic alliances, as well as the choice of interventions and the outcomes. So there's a recognition that cultural norms, cultural mores, cultural practices, influences, especially when you mix those with religion and spirituality, that I would say that is one of the most important things that need to be factored into care. Because ultimately, it doesn't matter, we as clinicians, how good we are, how competent we are, how much expertise we have, right? If clients do not engage with us, then we can't work with them. If clients do not trust us, then, and it's all about safety. It comes back to clients have to feel safe with us. And a lot of times when clients engage and then they disengage, it's about safety. And I want to go back there because even in the Black community, right, when it comes to certain things, such as, and we talk about homophobia, that is really, I would say, you know, homophobia within the Black community, that's a huge issue, right? And so I can remember referring clients to the psychiatrist, clients that were Black, male, and gay, to the psychiatrist, and they wouldn't engage. And then I would say to them, you know, the psychiatrist would call me and she would say, I don't know what's wrong with so-and-so. I saw them and they're telling me, oh, they want to kill themselves. And I'm thinking, okay, so you're gay. So what's the reason why you want to kill yourself? I don't know what the big deal is. And then the client would say to me, oh, I don't know. I'm not going back to see the psychiatrist. She doesn't understand. And it was only when when we talk and I say to her, yes, yeah, you know, but the reason why the client want to kill himself is because in the Black community, if you're gay, you're Black. That's a huge thing, Walter.
excuse me. Excuse me. So it's only after that she understood, and then she was able to talk to them, and she understood, you know why, that, okay, well, if you're, that's enough for you to have suicidal ideation, for you not to want to live, because if you're Black, you're gay, you're male, most of the time you're ostracized to the extent that you feel that life is no longer worth living. And so it was only after we talk about it that afterwards, subsequent to that, afterwards, when she was working with clients and they presented like this, and she understood, okay, I know, okay, well, it's a huge thing in the Black community, so I understand why this client, want to take their lives over it. So the main principles of cultural safety then is protocols, is in the protocols themselves, is the respect for cultural forms of engagement. And it's about checking in with people, to ask people, are you comfortable with this? Does this work for you? Is there anything you'd want me to do differently? All of these things, right? For a while too, with Black clients, when they would talk and people would write things down, then they wouldn't talk. Because we're oral, and especially with the ones that were involved with the justice system, they're extremely fearful that whatever they disclose in therapeutic sessions will be reported back to probation or parole or bail supervision. And so a lot of times they would disclose as long as the clinician wouldn't write things down. The moment the clinician would start to write down, they would say, oh, they would get afraid to talk, because they would be afraid that whatever is being written down, that's what's going to be on their record, and that's going to be disclosed. And so they just wouldn't say things. And so it was only afterwards when we talk about that, when the clinicians would say to them, oh, you know what, I'm writing this down, but it will not be reported. I'm only writing it down for my own reference because sometimes I have a difficult time recalling certain information. But it's also about personal knowledge, understanding one's own cultural identity, and sharing information about oneself to create a sense of equity and trust. And so a lot of time, we were talking about serious disclosure, right? From a Eurocentric point of view, we're trained, boundaries. We should not disclose anything about our lives, our situation, whatever. It's all about, it's a one-way street where the client just shares and we just sit there, right? And especially when we're working with Black parents, oftentimes, even when we facilitate groups, therapeutic support groups, this doesn't really work, because it's an exchange. It's, they want to know, okay, do you have kids, and does this work for you? And so it can't be, oh wow, we cannot talk about this. It has to be handled very differently, because it's about process, engaging in mutual learning, checking in on clients' cultural safety and the safety of the client, partnership, promoting collaborative practice, and also positive purpose, ensuring the process yields the right outcome for the client according to these values. Because recover for us, recover for the client may look very, very differently. So incorporating a cultural safety then in work with Black communities, SAPIS is aware that an individual's background can be a source of support or a source of stress, depending on the circumstances. There's certain cultural practices and beliefs, they're affirming, they're healthy, they're beneficial. But we also have to understand that not all cultural practices are that way. There's some cultural practices that they do not promote recovery. And so treatment planning should take this into consideration. So SAPIC is mindful of the need to promote a safe and equitable, non-stigmatizing and collaborative space. And this is what I say, for some of the clients, we never meet them at CAMH, because some of them, their first experience at CAMH, especially if they're part of the forensic system, is so traumatic, because their experience of coming here, some of them, I can remember a time when the client wouldn't meet me. And so I asked him, I met him at the corner, and I said, why don't you ever want to meet me at my office?
And he said, Donna, you don't understand. Most of my time the year before was always in handcuffs and in shackles. And every time I come through the door, all I can remember is that my first few times there, I was in handcuffs and I was in shackles. It brings me to a bad space. And so, okay, we met at the Burger King across the street because that was a safe space for him. And so assessments are not viewed as this one single entity in a three-hour process where a client is supposed to disclose their entire life to you and disclose their sexual abuse history, disclose their history of sex work, disclose all of these things at the first time they meet you. Assessments are viewed as an ongoing process that can last until the end of the therapeutic alliance or relationship, because it takes time for clients to build trust and to share crucial information. And so it's a Eurocentric approach to think that, you should meet a client and they should disclose everything to you very first visit when they don't know you. So there's no expectation on our part that, that clients will meet us and we'll ask these questions and then they're going to be truthful or they're going to disclose fully. So we get what we want and then we might come back to it again, 2 or 3 or 4 visits down the road. And so individual interventions must be designed with clearly defined pathways to empowerment and self-determination. So it's, what do you want to do? What do you want to see happen? How do you want this to be handled? So also when we talk about this framework, right, we're talking about the need for a gendered analysis, because for most of us in the community, if you're Black and you're female, very different from Black and male. Because I'm acutely aware of my privilege as a Black, middle-aged, middle-class female woman. Because I've been living in this country for over 30 years, and for the most part, I've been insulated. I've driven for over 30, I've never been pulled over. But I can say for absolute certain that with my partner in the car driving, we've been pulled over numerous times. So my experience, I just had the conversation with my coworker, because right now we're planning a truth and reconciliation with Toronto Police and Black youth. And I'm saying, and so they've asked me to be one of the backup counselors for clients that might be triggered or be in distress, to be there to provide support to the youth. And so one of the things I say to him, it's better for you as a Black man to be there. I recognize that even though I'm Black and I'm in the community, it's better for you because as a Black man, you're much better able to relate. And so the vulnerabilities of Black male in mental health delivery merit special consideration because they bear the brunt of anti-Black racism and systems-related trauma. And this, because before we talk about the past racial profile and the, police brutality, we talk about all of these system issues, right? And so when we talk about it, all of these systemic issues, right, in the school to prison pipeline, right? Consider this, like we're 3% of the population and yet 10% in the prison system. So even though we're 3% of the population in Canada, 10% of our Black men are in the prison system. And so when we talk about that, we have to talk about the devaluation of that exists among Black males. Because of everything that has happened, it's natural for Black males to believe that their value is not as much as the value of young men from other groups. Certainly not from the dominant culture, but also from other ethnic groups. Especially when you're being expelled, when you're being suspended at such a higher rate, when you're in the child welfare system at such a higher rate, when at every single system you're represented at such a higher rate. And so when we talk about that, we have to talk about the gender role strain that exists among Black men. Because the stress, and when I talk about gender role stress, gender role strain, I'm talking about the stress of day-to-day living among Black men. That I certainly, at times I cannot fully appreciate. I see it, but experiencing it, seeing it is another thing from living it, and it's another thing from working with Black youth that I've experienced this. And some of them have pointed it out to me. So when we talk about Black youth, we're also Black men or Black clients, right? Certainly mental health illness and substance dependence, those are what brings them to us in treatment, right? But in order to effectively engage with them and to build therapeutic alliances and to treat them over a long-term basis, then we also have to talk about all of these things. We also have to talk about the hypermasculinity that exists because, and the reasons, the underlying reasons for these hypermasculinity, for the hypermasculinity that exists. Because there's a need for Black men, Black youth, especially because that's the population that I have a frame of reference for them to, because they always have something to prove because of the devaluation. And so that wanting to prove, wanting to gain respect, it manifests, it comes out in hypermasculinity. And so it takes someone that have been through that process to guide clients into developing healthy male identities. Because Black males are dominated in spaces by mostly middle-aged, middle-class white women. When you look at the correctional services system, when you program bail services, when you look at the school system, certainly when you look at the child welfare system, this is what we're talking about. And so there's a lack of safe spaces across the board for Black males. Because if you're middle-aged, middle-class white women, then you cannot mentor and support Black children within the school system. It's difficult. It's extremely difficult to do because as a result of lack of lived experience. So also when you talk about that, right, intersectionality is a huge thing, right? When we talk about it, you have to think about race, class, gender, sexual orientation, and other intersecting identities, especially, when we're talking about where a lot of Black youth are now, coming out or transitioning, male to female, all of those, right? And the struggle that we're having within the community of, the study, the cultural, around cultural norms, and cultural beliefs. And how do we provide support to these clients? How do we understand? How do we provide support in order to promote and to sustain long-term recovery? And so this is when we talk about it has to be overall service, right? It has to be where the foundation certainly is a resiliency strength base, right? If, like I said before, if most of the systems are oppressive, if most of the services are not designed with your needs in mind, right? They're not designed, they're not planned for, the service planning, service delivery, treatment delivery, if that is not planned with your needs in mind, then the only way to survive these oppressive systems and to thrive and to recover within the system, right? Because not all the systems are going to be Afrocentric in their approach. Not all clinician is going to practice or even know about this approach, right? And so it's about building resiliency. It's about overcoming the stigma and the second-class citizenship that some clients living with mental health experiences even within the community. So it's always, overwhelmingly, the resilience strength base has to be the most important thing. Yes, it's important, to do pharmaceutical intervention. It's important. For all of these are important, right? But at the core of that, it has to be where the resiliency is strengthened. It has to be where you have, where recovery has to be viewed as an act of resistance. So resiliency has to be woven into all aspects of intervention. It has to be constantly reinforced. You're resilient, you're strong, you can do this. What is your resilience? What is it going to look like in terms of your recovery? If we're talking about your resilience, what does this word mean to you? What is it going to look like? What are some of the things we can do in order to build your resilience? What are your strengths? What are you good at? And how do we promote this? How do we keep promoting this in spite of everything else that tells you that you cannot? In spite of everything you see around, in spite of all the negative messages that you see that will cause you even to want not to be Black, how can we overcome this? Because like I always say to you, and like I say to, because how do we promote this idea that resistance is in your DNA? You can resist. And it's something that you have to do because, after all, you don't have a choice. And so what is your personal act of resistance going to look like directly as it relates to your recovery? Okay, I have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donna, for such an informative and educational webinar. I really enjoyed that, and I hope everyone else did too. This is just a reminder that this webinar has been recorded, and I will be sending out a link to the recording this afternoon. As well, a link to the evaluation and post-learning assessment will be sent by email this afternoon, and you will have 1 week to complete the post-learning assessment to receive your letter of completion. And if you participated as a group, please make sure that you email teach@kmh.ca with a list of participants by 2 p.m. today. And again, if you have missed the beginning of today's presentation, you would like to view it again, or you are interested in seeing previous Teach webinars, a list of our archived webinars is found on our website.